Good morning, and again, congratulations on reaching 40 years. I know my father had a small role to play back 40 years ago, and anniversaries are an opportunity to kind of revisit where we've been and also where we're going. Last night we talked about the autocephaly, and we're approaching 50 years of the autocephaly of the OCA, and today we turn to more liturgical topics with the, obviously, with the figure of Father Alexander Schmemann. As the Emeritus Father Alexander Professor of Liturgical Theology at St. Vladimir's, I cannot adequately express the magnitude of the debt and respect to him owed to him not only by the seminary, which he headed for nearly 30 years, but by all the Orthodox churches in North America and in fact worldwide. He left his mark on many areas of church life, touched countless people through his preaching. He was a marvelous preacher. His teaching, his lectures at university campuses, his frequent appearances on radio and television, including Radio Free Europe to Russia. He was instrumental in developing the autocephaly of the OCA along with my father. And more than any other person in his generation, he was the face of orthodoxy in North America during the last 3 decades of his life, the time he spent in America, which was obviously cut short by his very untimely sickness and death. He was only 62 when he passed away. But my task today is to focus on his liturgical legacy. Upon arriving to the United States in 1951, at the invitation of Father George Florovsky, who was then Dean of St. Vladimir's, Father Alexander became Professor of Liturgical Theology, and he quickly became aware of the challenges that lay ahead of him in the New World. Coming out of the academic atmosphere of St. Sergius in Paris, he found a different world in the Russian Orthodox Greek Catholic Church in America, then known as the Metropolitan. This church, descended directly from the 18th century Russian mission in Alaska, was very different from the émigré Russian community in France in which he grew up. While this church had a smattering of American converts from Western Christianity at that time, most of its members were descendants of Carpatho-Russian, Galician, or Ukrainian origin, primarily immigrants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century. They had come as economic refugees and settled largely in the coal mining hills of Pennsylvania, the Holy Land, and near the steel mills of the industrial Midwest. Many were former Uniats who joined the Orthodox Church under the leadership of Father Alexis Toth at the turn of the 20th century. A wave of Russian immigrants subsequently arrived after the Russian Revolution, settling primarily on the West Coast if they came through China, or the East Coast if they came through Western Europe. The High Russian community, however, was relatively small, and compared to the earlier immigration, much smaller compared to the earlier immigration, and certainly not as intellectually vibrant as the much larger Parisian one. Many of these Russians, the High Russians, so-called High Russians, ended up in the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, Rokor, I'm sure familiar to most of you, known then also as the Karlovci Synod, and thus remained largely isolated from their fellow Orthodox. Finally, Orthodoxy in America included not only the Metropolia, but also increasing numbers of Greeks, Arabs, Serbs, Romanians, Bulgarians, Albanians, independent Ukrainians, and others. It was a real melting pot. Many of these ethnic groups were further split along political lines, and in an effort to preserve their national and religious identities, the various Orthodox communities became ghettos. The level of education of both clergy and laity was at that time quite low. In the years following the Russian Revolution, Imperial Russian support for the church disappeared, the united orthodoxy envisioned by Archbishop and later Patriarch Tikhon vanished, and the ecclesiastical chaos that followed led to a general fragmentation and decline from which we are still suffering today. It was not until the late 1930s that theological education was restored with the establishment of 3 seminaries, St. Vladimir's and St. Tikhon's in the Metropolia, Holy Cross in the Greek Archdiocese, all in the same year. Of these 3, only St. Vladimir's from the very beginning sought to function like the academies in Russia, in other words, at a higher academic level. The liturgical situation was quite chaotic as well, not to say decadent. Each of the above groups brought with them their own local traditions to which they clung as a kind of security blanket in the New World, dominated as it was by foreign, Western forms of Christianity. In their ghettoized existence, they each attempted to maintain the inherited language and practices they brought with them. In the case of the Metropolia, for example, this included the use of Slavonic, a language most found completely incomprehensible. Since many were former Uniates, their practices was often Latinized. A number of parishes, for example, celebrated daily stipend masses during Great Lent. The musical style varied from the 19th century operatic style of Imperial Russian court to Carpatho-Russian and Galician prostopenia, or plain chant. The rich cycle of daily and weekly services was largely reduced to Sunday liturgy alone, often supplemented by a service called the Obednica, which is the Typica service. As was the case also with other Orthodox in America, communion was normally received only once a year. The typical parish bylaws in the Metropolia, for example, prescribed annual confession and communion in order to remain a member in good standing, i.e. be able to vote in the annual meeting. For the few who desired to receive communion more often, confession was required each time. The so-called priest prayers at the liturgy were always recited silently. Sometimes, in order to keep the service moving, they would be read in advance or even omitted. Baptisms were performed in private with only family and friends in attendance and never in conjunction with the Eucharistic liturgy. In seminaries, liturgical instruction was limited to rubrical details with no thought given to theological or historical factors. Liturgy was simply something one had to do to fulfill the formal requirements of orthodoxy. No reflection was deemed necessary. Now, some 70 years later, the picture is vastly different, due largely to the influence of Father Alexander. My assignment here is to cover his legacy in North America, but much of what I will say will apply to a greater or lesser extent to many Orthodox churches across the world, from Finland to Moscow to Beirut. First, Father Alexander established liturgical theology as a legitimate academic and theological discipline. His first book, Introduction to Liturgical Theology, remains a classic, read not only by students at Orthodox seminaries, but also in Roman Catholic seminaries and universities as well. It is, for example, on the required list for graduate students in liturgy at the University of Notre Dame, which is the chief center of liturgical study in North America. Schmemann is widely credited with being one of the fathers of the liturgical movement, and I had the privilege of writing a brief article about him in a volume entitled How Firm a Foundation, Leaders of the Liturgical Movement. Again, the liturgical movement was experienced not only by the Orthodox, but by Roman Catholics in the period before Vatican II, and largely influenced developments in the Catholic Church and subsequently also in Protestant churches. And so Father Schmemann is widely respected not only in Orthodox, but also other Christian circles. Father Alexander, moreover, was no more than a theoretician. He was first of all a pastor, and for him, scholarship and academic research were but tools needed to accomplish pastoral aims. In fact, and especially if you've read his diary, it was clear that he was rather allergic to academic scholarship for its own sake. He was interested not in the past, but in the here and now, in the contemporary life of the church. He saw the value of history, of course, but only for the sake of addressing contemporary pastoral issues. And it was precisely in the area of liturgical practice that he left his greatest mark. Allow me to present a few examples. Baptism. The Orthodox tradition with a small t that he inherited considered baptism as essentially a private rite. Baptisms were typically performed in private homes rather than in church, with only family and friends in attendance. I myself was baptized in this way in our small apartment on Rue d'Oriston in Paris, where we lived while my father was a student at Saint-Serge. Baptism was understood to be somehow essential for one's membership in the church, but in America it was primarily a party to celebrate a new birth. The focus was on the cute baby, the beautiful baptismal robe, and the food and drink that followed. Father Alexander set about to change this in the first book which he composed in America, Of Water and the Spirit. Here he argued forcefully that baptism is primarily an ecclesial event, marking the incorporation of a new member into the church, the body of Christ. As such, it should be conducted not in a private home, but in church. And because it is by nature a corporate, ecclesial event, it should, where possible, be celebrated in conjunction with the Eucharistic liturgy, precisely because he understood the celebration of the Eucharistic liturgy by the local parish community to be the full manifestation, the realization of the church into which the candidate, whether a child or an adult, is being incorporated. Ideally, therefore, the entire parish community should be present to welcome and to celebrate with its newest member. All this seems so normal nowadays, but 50 years ago this was revolutionary. As strongly and forcefully as he would argue this point, however, he was never dogmatic. He would one day in class condemn such liturgical abuses with his inimitable gusto, and the next happily perform the baptism of an infant relative at home, giving no indication that he considered the practice to be abusive. As a pastor, he was well aware that he had to begin in the same place as his flock. And it was in private conversation, as well as in his seminary classes, that he could vent his frustrations and forcibly express his own vision. Needless to say, not all were, or even today are, prepared to hear or accept this vision. Certainly in America at least, baptisms are now typically celebrated in church. All too often, however, they are still performed in private for family and friends and apart from the Sunday liturgy. But many priests, particularly those who studied with Father Alexander, never lost sight of this vision, and many parishes, particularly in the OCA, now celebrate baptisms as part of the regular Sunday liturgy. And Holy Saturday, which has the original Paschal baptismal vigil, is often the occasion for reception of adult converts. I've been in many parishes where as many as a dozen people are baptized or chrismated at that liturgy of Holy Saturday. However, there are others, including bishops, who continue to condemn such practices as innovations and who resist any change whatsoever. Perhaps the most significant impact of Father Alexander, though, was on Eucharistic practice. Having been formed in the rich theological atmosphere of Saint-Serge in Paris, and having been influenced particularly by Fathers Nicholas Afanasiev and Cyprian Caird, he understood the Eucharist to be the center of church life, the fullest manifestation of the church in a particular time and place. Upon coming to America, he consistently and energetically sought to implement this vision in parish life, and this is where he left his greatest mark. The challenges were great. Eucharistic reception was infrequent, typically as an obligation just once a year. The liturgy was usually conducted in Church Slavonic, a language that was totally incomprehensible to the average parishioner. The priest's prayers were read silently. Preaching was virtually non-existent. More generally, the church was experienced by most as an ethnic club whose chief purpose was to help foster one's cultural identity as Russian, Carpatho-Russian, Ukrainian, Serb, Greek, etc. And the liturgy itself was used as a tool to accomplish this, thus becoming a manifestation of this fallen world rather than a foretaste of the kingdom to come. Because the challenges were so great, Schmemann had to attack the problems on many fronts. He did so, first of all, by his personal example. For him, there was no greater joy than to stand at the Eucharistic altar, and this joy was there for all to see. He had the deep intuition that what would draw people to Christ was not rules, laws, obligations, or threats, but a positive, joyful experience and vision of the kingdom, which is already granted to us here in this world, if we are ready and willing to accept it. It was this joy that all his life he sought so hard to transmit in both the written and spoken word. Everything that he did was guided by this fundamental vision. He struggled to make the liturgy available in a language accessible to the people, hence his involvement in the development of English texts of the liturgy. He promoted actively the recitation aloud of the priestly prayers, particularly the anaphora, pointing out that these prayers, in fact, belong to all the faithful, the priestly assembly. He encouraged more frequent and regular reception of the Eucharist, which raised additional questions about the connection between the sacraments of confession and communion. It is hard to overstate how revolutionary such an approach seemed back in the 50s and 60s. Father Schmemann's legacy is most pronounced precisely in the dramatic change in Eucharistic practice. In 1992, when I was chairman of the OCA's Liturgical Commission, I conducted a survey of OCA clergy. The results were startling. 80% read all or part of the Eucharistic anaphora aloud. 95% encouraged frequent communion. 39% celebrated baptisms in conjunction with the Eucharistic liturgy, and 69% would do so if the bishop allowed, because at that time bishops were not allowing this. Though I have no statistics for other Orthodox jurisdictions, I have personally witnessed large numbers of regular Sunday communicants in nearly all the parishes that I have visited over the years, whether Greek, Antiochian, Romanian, or Russian, and increasingly even Serbian. They seem to be the most resistant. Now, this brings us to the topic of confession and communion, because that was obviously a major obstacle. In the Slavic liturgical tradition in which Schmemann was raised, the sacrament of confession was required each time before receiving communion. When communion was received only once a year, this posed little difficulty. But with the more frequent reception of communion, this posed a tremendous challenge. The clergy would be overwhelmed by the huge number of penitents, the faithful would resent much more frequent confession, and confession itself would become merely a routine formality stripped of much of its content. Adding to the confusion was the lack of a clear consensus among all Orthodox about the very meaning and necessity of confession. Orthodox practice varies widely. For the Slavic churches, confession is generally a formal requirement. The faithful are expected to confess once a year to maintain their good standing in the church. Among those who follow Greek practice, confession never became a legal requirement, and the vast majority of the faithful in North America have never experienced the sacrament of confession. It's about 95% in the Greek Archdiocese have never been to confession once in their lives. So it's talk about diversity of practice. This is particularly the case, as I just mentioned, for the Greek Orthodox living here in the West, because they do not have ready access to monastic spiritual elders to whom the faithful would typically go to confession in Greek practice. They would never consider going to their parish priest. He's the guy you sit and drink ouzo with in the village square. If you want to go to confession, you go to a spiritual elder. And in Greece, there are monasteries around every corner. In this country, there are not, and the monasteries that are there, I might want to stay away from. Needless to say, the pastoral challenge was great. Indeed, in order to encourage more frequent communion, Father Alexander has struggled to sever the one-to-one connection between confession and communion. Even more importantly, he needed to restore a deeper understanding of confession. In most parishes of the Slavic tradition, the once-a-year requirement for confession meant that, typically on Holy Thursday, which was one of the traditional days for one's annual communion, the faithful would line up for confession. I was personally witnessed one occasion when the Holy Thursday liturgy began 2 hours late because of the rush of last-minute penitents lined up outside the door. Administered in such a way, each annual confession could only last 1 or 2 minutes and consisted of a few quickly uttered prayers, several routine questions by the priest, and the prayer of absolution, a process that edified no one. In some Orthodox traditions, preparation for communion requires not only confession, but up to a week of fasting and abstention from marital relations and so on. These stringent requirements not only make frequent communion virtually impossible, but also leads to a temptation to think that by performing such feats of asceticism, one is made worthy of the reception of communion. This potential danger led Father Alexander to compose one of his most strident articles, called Holy Things for the Holy, Some Remarks on Receiving Holy Communion. It's published in the appendix to his book, Great Lent, and it bashes that tradition, which makes you feel that if you've done all these things, you're somehow holy and prepared, rather than, as the liturgy itself says, it is only, one is holy, one is Lord, but that is our confession of sin, and in fact our acknowledgement that it is Christ who makes us holy and not anything that we ourselves can do. In order to address these problems and to encourage more frequent communion, in 1972, Father Alexander prepared a report on this subject for the Holy Synod of the OCA. He concludes by making a number of recommendations, all of which were adopted by the bishops. In particular, he proposed the introduction of general confession as a supplement to the customary individual confession. This proposal, which severed the one-to-one link between confession and communion, made possible much greater Eucharistic participation by the faithful. In addition, because general confession include an enumeration by the priest of all acts, thoughts, and desires with which we offend the holiness of God, the sanctity of our neighbor, and the sanctity of our soul, unquote, it provided an opportunity to teach the faithful about the nature of sin and as something more than simply the violation of some commandment or rule. I vividly remember his classes in pastoral theology, in which he described how parishioners would approach their yearly confession and have no sins whatever to confess, after which they would stand there waiting to receive absolution from the priest so they could fulfill their annual obligation and remain members in good standing. The introduction of general confession at that time was thus an important step for those Orthodox coming out of the Slavic traditions, but it certainly did not solve everything. For Father Alexander was keenly aware of the problematic history of penance and confession in the Orthodox Church. He was well aware that modern society had largely lost its understanding of sin, and that contemporary Orthodoxy did not have a clear understanding of the nature and purpose of the sacrament of confession. How often in his journals he complains about people's misconceptions about confession, about their treating him as a kind of guru who could resolve all their personal problems. This was an area, however, in which he did not find the time for further work of reflection. As I'll mention at the end, the whole issue of confession is still one that needs greater reflection in the Orthodox Church. Needless to say, not all Orthodox in America were comfortable with what Father Alexander said or did, even within the Metropolia, known since 1970 as the Orthodox Church in America. There was certainly resistance to the use of English, to the recitation of the secret prayers aloud, to baptismal liturgies, to presanctified liturgies in the evening, to more frequent communion, etc. The opposition generally came from those who simply wished to preserve the customs with which they grew up and which they identified with traditional orthodoxy, making no distinction between tradition with a capital T and local traditions with a lowercase t. That's a nice formulation invented by Father George Florovsky. And it came from all levels of church life, from bishops to priests to lay people. Little did they understand that what Father Alexander was proposing was a return to an authentic Orthodox tradition that restored baptism and the Eucharist to their central place in church life, that integrated liturgy and theology, liturgy and life. To his great credit, Schmemann knew that things could not be changed overnight, that patience was needed because the faithful needed preparation and time to digest these changes. I remember vividly how in class he would angrily condemn the then common practice of celebrating one memorial service, panihida, after another, after liturgy on Sunday. Don't people know that the deceased are already commemorated during the Eucharistic liturgy? That our participation in communion is the best way to express our unity with and our love for them. But the next Sunday he would, without a single complaint, happily preside over just such a panihida. He was ever the teacher and pastor. While guided by a strong and clear vision of what should be, he was always gentle and patient in implementing it, an example that was not, unfortunately, followed by all who followed him. There were priests who came out very enthusiastic from St. Vladimir's, I'm going to solve all your problems tomorrow, and I know and you don't. I mean, that kind of attitude he was always warning people against. In the years since his passing away, the debate which he started has not ebbed. There are still those who continue to resist what they call his innovations. I recall an article that appeared in a diocesan journal not too long ago, which condemned the reading of prayers aloud and defending the silent recitation of the anaphora on the basis that Hannah's prayer in 1 Samuel was uttered in silence, a private prayer, that God heard. As I have already indicated, however, it would not be an exaggeration, rather, to say that much of what Father Alexander said has entered into the mainstream within the Orthodox Church in America. More frequent participation in communion has in recent decades also become normative in a number of other jurisdictions, even though, especially through former students of St. Vladimir's Seminary, even in some parishes in the Serbian Archdiocese in America. In other aspects, however, liturgical practice in many of these jurisdictions has been less affected by his work. It's primarily in the more frequent reception of communion that has reached further. Perhaps his greatest contribution, however, is not so much in these very practical aspects of liturgical life, but in the development of an overarching vision about the very essence of Christian life as it is expressed in the Church's liturgy. He clearly saw the challenges that secularism posed for the Church. In his writings, and particularly his talks, he constantly argued for a sacramental view of life, in which one's ecclesial and secular life remained one integrated whole. He strenuously argued against a disincarnate and dualistic spirituality, as well as against those who sought to reduce the Church merely to this world and its problems. No work of his expresses this vision more clearly than his For the Life of the World, probably his best book. Originally a series of lectures given to a non-Orthodox Christian audience, and generally regarded again as his best and most influential book. Allow me to cite the introduction. Quote, And thus, our real question is, how can we hold together in faith, in life, in action, these seemingly contradictory affirmations of the Church? How can we overcome the temptation to opt for and absolutize one of them, falling thus into the wrong choices or heresies that have so often plagued Christianity in the past? It is my certitude, he continues, that the answer comes to us not from the neat intellectual theories, but above all from that living and unbroken experience of the Church which she reveals and communicates to us in her worship, in the liturgia, always making her that which she is, the sacrament of the world, the sacrament of the kingdom, their gift to us in Christ. This was the fundamental vision that guided all his work. His goal was never to alter the liturgy in any way, or to return to some golden age, but to make the liturgy transparent, and thus capable of revealing the Church as the manifestation of the kingdom and us as its citizens. It was this, more than anything else, which enabled him to experience the liturgy as pure joy, a joy that he radiated to those who benefited from his presence, and which continues to shine in the written words he has left behind, as well as in the countless persons whom he continues to touch. I'd like to conclude with just a few remarks about what I see as remaining issues. Not that everything that he promoted has been fully digested yet by the Church, so that remains an ongoing problem. But there are two issues that he did not really have time to address. I'm sure he would have had he lived. One which I alluded to is the sacrament of confession. Because if one looks at the practice in the Orthodox Church, it varies tremendously, and there is no common or clear understanding about the nature and purpose of the sacrament of confession. And there are many historical reasons for this. We know that in the early Church, in the early centuries, probably at least through the 6th and 7th century, confession or penance was reserved for people who had committed major sins, especially apostasy, and who needed to be reconciled with the Church. It was allowed once in your lifetime. And in fact, there are documents like the Shepherd of Hermas that said, that this wasn't even to be told to catechumens and neophytes out of fear that they not take their baptism seriously. Confession usually involved publicly known sins, primarily apostasy, and required years and sometimes lifelong exclusion from communion and reconciliation with the Church after some years, and in some cases only on the deathbed. But then, the problem with that method is that it didn't address kind of the more ordinary, petty sins of daily life. Certainly the liturgy and the penitential prayers in the liturgy and in the daily cycle of worship took care of that, as indeed the reception of communion, which is for the healing of soul and body. We confess our sins in the liturgy constantly. So where does sacramental confession fit in all this? Well, the historical development tells us that beginning with the 4th century, another model began to develop, which arose in monasticism. When a novice enters a monastery, he or she is attached to a monastic elder who helps him or her to, sometimes on a daily basis, to examine their conscience, to share one's thoughts, and then to provide appropriate pastoral guidance. And it was this model of pastoral guidance that over the centuries got merged with the more formal penitential process that had existed earlier. And so we developed this new model in which confession could be heard initially by monastics. Even today in the Orthodox Church, one can go to confession to a priest or a bishop, but also to a monastic, male or female, who is authorized by the bishop to hear confession. I remember going to confession as a child to a nun in a convent in France. So you can see how the two traditions kind of got mixed together. But obviously with the entrance and with the increasing influence of monks, and monks had a huge influence in church life. For example, after iconoclasm in the 8th and 19th centuries, it became the rule that bishops could only be drawn from monastic circles. So nowadays, bishops, at least formally, are monks, sometimes only formally one day before they get consecrated, never having spent a day in their life in a monastery. But nevertheless, there's this kind of ideal that somehow monks make the best bishops. Not always the case. I know in the Russian church, the best bishops are usually widowed priests. And many of the early bishops in the OCA were in fact widowed clergy. But anyway, with this shift, paradigm shift that took place from kind of formal reconciliation for major sins, apostasy, murder, the shift went because of its focus on examination of conscience and because of its monastic provenance, largely to sexual sins, because that's the big hang-up for monastics. So, for example, there are many monastic handbooks published for confessors. The first one, ascribed to John the Faster, who became a patriarch of Constantinople, has lists of questions for different categories of people, for men, women, married, single, young, old, etc. And the first question is, my son, when did you first lose your virginity? Very interesting, because basically this kind of confession is modeled now on the process of enrolling and growing in faith or in spirituality in a monastic setting in which you examine all these things. So and then if you get into the later Greek and Slavic ones, I mean, most of the questions deal with sexual sins. On top of that, but again, during this whole period, until roughly the 18th century, confession was never an absolute requirement for the reception of communion, unless you fall into major sin, in which it would be required. But and because we're OCA and we follow a Slavic tradition, we inherited a tradition where from the 18th century onward, confession became a legal, formal requirement once a year, punishable by a series of fines if you did not comply. This was under Catherine the Great. And in fact, under imperial law, priests even had to reveal to the authorities any sins committed against the Tsar or the government. So you can see how pastorally confession really became a problem. So the issue we have to discover now is, what is it for, how often, and so on. And, it's hard to give fast and hard rules about this, but I think it's a critical issue that the Orthodox will have to face. Another issue, which Father Schmemann did not address at all, but which I have tried to address in my classes at seminary, is the problem with the lectionary. I noticed here that you have an Old Testament reading. But those who follow kind of the received tradition, I mean, we have three lectionaries. We have one for weekdays, which is, basically the Bible, at least the New Testament, in the full course. There's a Saturday lectionary and a Sunday lectionary. And of course, what people are exposed to, since we've become largely a Sunday church, is only the Sunday lectionary, in which only a third of the gospel, roughly, is actually heard on Sunday. And the Sunday Gospels are picked because they're either parables of the kingdom or miracle stories. Sunday is a festal day. It's the foretaste of the kingdom and so on. So it's those readings that are selected that we hear on Sundays. And so, but you never hear on a Sunday the Sermon on the Mount. It's not prescribed for any Sunday of the year. And you hear sometimes 3 times a year about the pigs jumping in the water. And I pity the poor priests that have to preach on the same reading 3 times each year. So something needs to be done about the Sunday lectionary. Unfortunately, the Catholics beat us to it. They've developed a very nice system of 3-year lectionary. Some of you may have heard about that. a principle like that could very easily be adopted in an Orthodox setting, where on Sundays where the hymnography is tied to the Scripture, like during the Sundays of Lent and during the Paschal season, you can keep the readings, but then the rest of the year you could do John's Gospel, which we begin on Easter, and one of the three Synoptic Gospels, and rotate them on a 3-year cycle. It would be very easy to do. Less significant, but I think also of some importance, is the Old Testament, which has probably since around the 10th century disappeared. Old Testament readings remain in our present practice on vigils, on Vespers, or on eves of major feasts like Christmas and Theophany and Pascha and so on. But the regular cycle of Old Testament readings, I was very happy to hear one in this chapel, but that's certainly not the general practice in the Orthodox Church. Here there are different ways that that could be brought about. I mean, I know that New Speed has developed an Old Testament lectionary, but I know in one parish, for example, well, one priest, just 1 year, they added the book of Isaiah and read through the whole book of Isaiah, and he preached on it during the course of 6 months. So, I mean, there are different ways to do it, but it is something that could be done, since we Orthodox tend to be rather illiterate when it comes to Scripture. I mean, if we paid more attention to our liturgical text, and especially if we participated in the full cycle of liturgical services, which is only possible at seminary or in a monastery, but that's not the case. So we have to adapt and I believe that Father Schmemann would be very much in support of this had he remained with us then. But I think I've been speaking long enough. I think we should open it up for questions and discussion. Yes?
You stated all the things that were initiated actually liturgical renewal. Well, since it's dead, and since Father John's dead, a lot of that has kind of subsided. For example, recently I was in New York, and I went to the Antiochian Cathedral, because it's close to where I was. And prayers were silent. Not only were silent, it took like 5 minutes with a choir or chanters going on something totally incomprehensible because of their way of singing. And there was a lot of people going to community. A lot of these things, I've gone to other churches where, these things just kind of not there. And for example, we were able to include the Old Testament readings because Metropolitan theologians at the time approved it. But I would dare say most bishops today would not. And a lot of the things that you just said at the end, if it's done by a priest that says, it's better to seek forgiveness and permission, than they will do, but there are very few of that. Why did that happen?
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, there was, during the 60s and 70s, when Father Schmemann and my father were active, there was a lot of enthusiasm and, a lot of openness to that kind of discussion. And you're right, we've kind of entered a period in which there's been some regression. And it's hard. I wonder, I mean, part of the problem, I think, is that we have a large number of clergy and faithful and even bishops who are recent converts and who are, fleeing what they perceive as the radical innovations that they found in the other churches. And so it's a psychological thing. I mean, they're running away from something and they want to hang on to something that they perceive as tradition. tradition very much with a small t. These kind of local practices. That's part of it. I think another part of it is, I can speak especially for the OCA. We are really unhealthily divided between two camps. I hate to say it. We have two seminaries that promote two very different visions of what liturgical life is supposed to be, and it's really hurtful. And one sees that when one goes to all American councils. There are two separate camps, and it's very unhealthy. And, we had a while where we had a metropolitan who was the former rector of Metropolitan Herman, we all know, who kind of was opposed to this from the very beginning. But I'm in a parish now that has a St. Tikhon's graduate, and he is a total Schmemelite. Prayers are allowed. Pretty close to congregational singing, and he kind of absorbed all these changes. So it varies from one place to another. Things are certainly better now than they were 50 years ago. Maybe they've regressed a little bit, but there's no way that we'll ever go back to where we were back then. But in other jurisdictions, it really varies. I know in the Antiochian Archdiocese, it's very uncommon to have prayers read aloud, for example. Although more frequent communion has become the norm there. But I'm a mentor in the St. Stephen's program, which is their correspondence course that they use for training deacons and lay leaders and even and convert clergy. And I make them read Shema. And I make them write papers about the ecclesial nature of baptism. And I make sure to emphasize that baptism and Eucharist belong together. So those of us who have accepted that vision do our best to promote it. But you're right, there is resistance. But it's interesting, when I go abroad, there are places in Russia now where communion has become much more frequent, where prayers are read aloud. I was in a liturgy in Greece, presided over by Metropolitan John Zizoulos, where he read the entire anaphora aloud. I was in a Greek that nobody understood. The Greeks, unfortunately, have the biggest problem of all, because they got the original language of Scripture and liturgy. And it's a language that ordinary people cannot understand, but to go away from the original language, it's much different. With Slavonic, which is basically like 17th century Ukrainian, or close to it, you can, even there are debates about modernizing the language. We in England, we Americans are fortunate. Our biggest fights are whether to use thee and thou or you and your. But it's really amazing. When I was directing a choir in Detroit, I had a man in my choir who was a vice president of Ford Motor Company, an engineer, highly educated, well off, and we sang we did both Slavonic and English. So we sang Spasi Gospodi, O Lord, save your people. So we sang in Slavonic. I said, okay, now let's do it in English. O Lord, save your people. He came up to me after, he says, I've been singing this for 65 years. That's the first time I realized it's the same thing. So, this was not that long ago. So it's clear. I think Father Schmeman's primary goal was not so much to reform the liturgy, but to make it transparent, to make people participate, to make people realize that, it is their prayer, that they're all the priestly people together. By the way, Father, I don't agree with the statement in the liturgy book about that we praise, we bless, we give thanks. You say it's to cover kind of the epiclesis. It's actually not. It's actually part of the anaphora. If you read the text of the anaphora, the early manuscripts, it's remembering all the things that have been done for us. Cross, tomb, death, resurrection, ascension, sitting at the right hand, offering your own of your own. In Slavonic, prinosashin, prinosi. Although the contemporary Greek and English text says we offer. But if it's offering is the original term, you've got two participles. Where's the active verb?
sentence.
Huh?
It's in the next sentence.
We praise, we bless, we give thanks.
That's true. Well,
Which is said by the people.
That's true, but
Yeah.
when you consider its content, it's just a restatement of the first sentence of the inaugural.
Well,
And what-
sure it is, but in this case, it's actually recited by the people. It's, in my opinion, it's a major theological
There are
issue.
interesting things to be said about that, because you
Yeah.
see there's a new beginning made. Once again, we do this. We don't do
Yes,
this.
but that's the beginning of a new sentence.
But that is where textual criticism comes in, and you find out that that's not ancient.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I mean,
There's a question.
that's what liturgists do, is we fight among ourselves and things like that. But I like to make it a major theological issue. Yes, Father?
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation, and I interesting experience listening to you. And I keep telling it to my friends and parishioners that we are taking so much for granted. But listening to you, I just kind of, I heard it. Yeah, that's how much for granted we are taking, like at the cathedral only year 1978, liturgy, main liturgy was in Church Slavonic, people would receive Eucharist once a year. And how far away from that? And then, of course, it's normal regression. Yeah, oh yes, we are doing well, let's preserve our fundamentals, foundations, and but that's normal. Thank you so much for pointing
I
it
was
out.
teaching Slavonic my last few years at seminary. We referred to it affectionately as slow phonic. No, because you couldn't teach grammar. You basically taught them how to do a panihida and, sing, say a few prayers and the Lord's Prayer in Slavonic for when they go out to visit parishioners. But, it's a dead language. Okay, any more? Yes?
Well, just one question. This is kind of all the same vein, but the seminary today, and I don't know who's the dean of it, are Schmemann's philosophies and theories still as strongly expressed and taught as when he was there, when your father was there, when Tahaka was there? All of those kind of continue this tradition. Is it still being taught the same way?
Well, it certainly was when I was there until 2 years ago. In a sense, I mean, the people who are there, it's not that they've rejected it, but they take it for granted. And so when it comes to baptismal liturgies, they don't remember the blood that was spilt to fight that battle. So they say, okay, if you want to do it, I mean, they don't insist as much as they should on implementing that. Simply because it's no longer the pressing issue for them that it once was. So it's not that there's any kind of rejection of it. It's just become, ordinary. It's nothing to argue about anymore.
Oh, okay.
So I would kind of put it that way. Yeah.
Well, the upcoming council, I believe the theme is for the life of the world. Is there a possibility that that theme will carry on, going back to those writings and that thought, kind of just more shared?
Well, I haven't seen the presentations that will be made at the All American Council, so I can tell you. But it's clearly inspired by his vision that the theme was chosen. How deeply will be reflected in the council, I can't say.
I guess, another question, going back to the substance of my earlier question. You mentioned that the Roman Catholics lead us through it with this clear election. You mentioned things along those lines for if a priest did it, how many bishops would not come down on the front of those? Or how many bishops would just shut it down?
Well, I mean, I think, there's certain things that you can do, with permission from the bishop. I think some bishops would allow it, not all. But certainly this is a topic that could well be brought up in clergy gatherings and in meetings with the bishop. You know, you don't want to hit them with it unprepared. You know, I think but what I'm trying to say is we have to begin that conversation. We're not even talking about it. I mean, until we begin to talk about it and then give it time to percolate and for people to realize what the issues are, then you can begin to address it. I mean, there's certainly things like introducing the New Testament reading. Usually priests will not get into trouble for adding things. It's when they take things away that they get in trouble with. So, I mean, it's certainly possible to, I don't think too many bishops would object to the introduction of an Old Testament reading, for example, in the liturgy. Now, changing the lectionary, the gospel lectionary, that might be more problematic because, I mean, the other consideration is, I mean, the fact that all the Orthodox across the world read the same gospel, you know, on Sunday, I mean, is a unifying factor. I mean, if you look at global Orthodoxy, the one unifying factor is our liturgical tradition, which is the same whether you're in Beirut or Moscow. I mean, it has a different style, the music sounds different, I mean, there are different adaptations, but it's still the unifying tradition. You know, it does more to unite the Orthodox than our structures, which tend to be pretty dysfunctional. You know, you try to hold a council and 4 churches don't show up. You know, so it is our liturgical, our spiritual and liturgical tradition that's the glue that binds the Orthodox. And Father Schmemer would actually talk about that too. I mean, you know, there are limits to how far you can go from, but certainly the kinds of things that Father Schmemer introduced were not violations at all of the tradition, but in fact were bringing to light what was there. And he would often say, one of the blessings of the conservatism is that we didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so that when the time came when you could restore some of these practices, they were there to be rediscovered and didn't have to be reinvented from nothing. So it's always, you know, you have to take multiple, you know, you can't, you know, as Father Schmemer and my father would often say, you can never simplify things. You cannot ever take one item, let's say the way we do our liturgy, and turn it into an idol, you know, at the expense of every other aspect of Orthodox church life. Okay?
No,
We'd like
thank
to
you.
thank you very much. Very, very much. I'd like to invite everybody to join us in the hall next door for a continuation of our 40th luncheon. Celebration luncheon.